So I'm just trying to figure out how we end up here today, and had an opportunity to sit down with many in the community, and I've learned several different things about this Christopher Ballou case. And joining me today is John Burton. Mr. Burton is the attorney representing the 21-year-old Altadena motorist who back in November of 2017, I believe it was the 9th of November, and he was stopped by Pasadena police officers in Altadena. And I'm just trying to figure out this whole thing. So, Mr. Burton, thank you so much for sitting down with me this morning and joining the conversation live.
Well, thank you very much, and if you call me John, I'll call you Jenny.
All right, fair enough. That's what we'll do. So, how do we end up here? I mean, kind of just before we jump into this video and really kind of understand what happened, we're going to break down some specific things that Pasadena police officers did, maybe what they could have done differently. We want to look at what some best practices are, as well as how they use their use of force. So, how do we end up here?
Well, this started for me when, on December 4th, a mysterious bystander video surfaced that caught sort of the middle of the incident. I would say that the bystander video was brutal, but it was also very ambiguous as to what happened. After that, I was contacted by Chris Ballou, and he's a very good historian. He gave me a very detailed description of what led up to it. And coincidentally, shortly after that, the body camera and car videos were released by the city of Pasadena. I then got them, and they matched very exactly with what he had told me had happened and had led up to it. But I realized that by looking at any one of these videos, that didn't tell the whole story. So I thought, well, I'm going to edit them together, sort of like I was making a feature film, and go to the different sources and try to lay it out chronologically with the best video and tell the story in this film that we're about to see. I wanted to keep it short. It came in a little under 5 minutes. I posted it on my Facebook page, and it's now had over 500,000 views.
Let's jump into this, because really I think there's a lot of misperception about what actually happened. You know, obviously if you look at the 45-second video, which we'll show a little bit later on, that by the bystander, that shows one point of view. And then we're going to look here at this composite. So let's first just kind of break it down. Let's go ahead and cue this up. So what's happening here? Where are we at right now?
Well, we're north of Woodbury and headed north uphill into Altadena. About a half a block south of Woodbury is the northern border of Pasadena. So this is the city, or the town of Altadena. It's unincorporated Los Angeles County, and it's policed by the sheriffs. So they really had no business being up there. It's not their area of responsibility. There is policy that governs this, which they are in violation of. They're allowed to go into, let's say, another jurisdiction to pursue a criminal or to investigate a crime that took place in Pasadena, but they're not free just to go out of their jurisdiction and patrol for minor traffic violations.
Well, specifically, that is extraterritorial arrest policy of Pasadena Police Department, which is policy number 100.3.1, concerning how officers can pursue, you know, either a fresh crime or what I guess some would consider hot pursuit, right?
Right, exactly.
So these guys were just kind of out of their normal area of jurisdiction, at least a half a mile north up into Altadena when they first spot Christopher, right?
Right, and headed away from Pasadena.
They were headed away from Pasadena, so
Yes.
they're headed northbound. And so at this point, we saw just a little bit earlier. Let's back up just a little bit.
Well, this I find very significant. First, Chris is driving just one of these cars that's coming southbound because he's in the number 2 lane, the slow lane, and he's behind a car, which means he's not speeding. And he's just doing nothing that would seem, this is 7:45 in the evening, there's just nothing here that would draw attention from a police officer, other than the fact that because of an equipment issue, his high beams weren't working properly. And that's exactly what a Pasadena officer should not be doing out of his area of responsibility. You'll see that they do something that I find very strange if you stop right there. They're shining their spotlight, not their emergency lights, but their white spotlight directly in his face. Now these spotlights are designed for two purposes. Number one, to illuminate areas for officers, but they're also intended to make it very difficult for people to see facing the lights. And so to shine this in the face of a motorist is a hazard, and it's a tactic that I've never seen before, and I find it to be absolutely bizarre.
Because those lights are more so for a defensive measure for the officer's protection, right?
Exactly,
Okay.
exactly. And when they do traffic stops at night, they're trained to position the lights so that they're coming to the suspect or the subject out of the lights. So it's very difficult for them to be seen. They bust a U, which is actually a traffic violation itself. They're driving now about 50 miles an hour, still in Altadena. Now Chris then turns into the gas station. I think this is significant because at this time the warning lights have not been put on, so he's not being pulled over. So if we come in and stop, you can see that Chris is moving very slowly. He's locking the car there and putting his keys in his pocket. He knows the officers are there. He stops. So when we stop it here. Now, that's Officer Esparza. There are several things here. Number one, they didn't radio what they were doing first, which is a violation of best practices. If they were really concerned that this was a dangerous situation, they obviously would have radioed because they were part of a team that was patrolling. There were a lot of other officers involved. At least explain where they were and what they were doing. They didn't do that. They just popped out of the car. And secondly, and this is really, things just started going downhill from there. This has now become a pedestrian stop rather than a traffic stop. Now, at this point, best practices are very specific, and they're detailed in what's called the learning domain of the Peace Officer Standard and Training, or POST. That he's to use his verbal skills. He's to keep a certain distance between the person he's stopping, the pedestrian stop at this point, and himself, to keep his gun, away, and then use his verbalization. I'm going to have to write you a ticket for your equipment violation. I'm going to need to see your license. Do you have it on you? I'm going to need your registration and insurance. Is it in the car? We're going to have to retrieve it. This is how we're going to do that. And then people generally comply.
Is now, could have potentially. So this is kind of where the officer erred in the way that he approached Chris. And
it just shows how just an utter lack of any regard for basic officer training and safety steps that runs. They're not afraid of this guy, and they're just disregarding just basic principles of officer safety. Now you have Officer Lujan, who's on the left here, who is the cover officer, not the contact officer, now interjecting himself into the communications, which is now another violation of best practices.
why is that? Because I think that's an important point to kind of understand. When you're being contacted by an officer, or two officers for that matter, why is it important that one be the communicating officer and one be the cover officer? Maybe people might not understand that.
Well, because, number one, their roles are completely different. The communication officer, who's also the contact officer, will talk to the person, so the person has his attention focused on a single officer, and that the verbalization is consistent, so that the person is not getting confusing commands, he's not looking back and forth, but the situation is controlled. The idea is to control the situation, to remove the risk to the officers, to remove the risk to the subject, to remove the risk to bystanders. And then the cover officer will take a position, and we frequently call it triangulation, which means that he should be out of the line of fire, and he should be looking not only at the interaction between the contact officer and the subject, but also looking at the environment. Are there other bystanders? Are there people who might get involved? Is there traffic? And then he can also communicate with backup and so on as
So
required.
Officer Lujan at this point is going now kind of outside of that best practice that you're describing and, so to speak, jumping in it.
He's destabilizing an already destabilized situation. That's been destabilized by Esparza going hands-on and not using verbal skills. Now he's compounding the error, and this is ABC of police work. I mean,
Let's go ahead and go a little bit.
at this point, Esparza decides he's going to put out what he should have done before.
I'm gonna put it out real quick.
He says, I'm going to put this out. Now, for some reason, and Esparza pushes him into the car and bends his left arm behind his back. Tactically, I mean, what is he doing? He's not using commands. And then what happens here is just very, very strange. Watch him become shorter and shorter in this segment because they're kicking his feet apart until they absolutely drop him to the ground. Why they're doing a takedown here, I can't even begin to understand.
And then also we'll see just in a few frames forward, we see Chris's right hand on the top of the car, right?
Right.
And so they have his left hand, which was always kind of the controlling limb that they had on him. And so later on we're going to kind of see them say they can't get his hands.
Yeah, that's a good point, James, because Esparza has his left arm bent behind him. Chris has his cell phone in his right hand. Then you have Lujan, who should be doing backup and not be involved in this at all. He should be standing 15, 20 feet away and watching for the situation for other people. Orders Chris to give him his right hand, which, if you look in this film, makes no sense because that's going to turn Chris around and go contrary to what Esparza is doing, which is pushing Chris flush against the car. So this is an example of why we don't have two officers just sort of doing whatever, but we have one officer taking the contact communication role and directing the person to do what he wants him to do, and the other officer standing back and providing cover and backup. So this is an example of why that rule should be followed, by it's being broken here.